Pick something in this room, not a person, an object, a cup, a chair leg, the edge of a table. Look at it for 10 seconds with the specific intention of understanding one thing about it that you do not currently understand. Not what it's called, not what it's for, why it is the way it is, what forces shaped it, what physics it obeys right now while you're looking at it. Hold that. Because in the next 10 minutes, something is going to shift in the way your prefrontal cortex processes ambiguity, and the shift is not metaphorical, it is measurable, it involves specific neurotransmitters, and it has a precise molecular signature that is different from the state you are in right now. Richard Feynman did not have an unusual brain. The neuroscience on this is unambiguous. When his IQ was measured as a teenager, it registered at 125, respectable, thoroughly ordinary for a physicist. His Nobel Prize-winning work on quantum electrodynamics was not the product of raw processing speed. What Feynman had, what he trained, what he practiced as a deliberate cognitive protocol, was a specific relationship between first principles decomposition and working memory load. He had, in effect, engineered a mental operating mode. And that operating mode has a neurological address. Here is what happens in your brain when you genuinely do not understand something but are actively trying to. The prefrontal cortex, specifically the lateral regions, Brodmann areas 9 and 46, enters what cognitive neuroscientists call a high uncertainty encoding state. Dopamine release from the ventral tegmental area increases. Not the dopamine of reward, the dopamine of prediction error. Your brain's model of the world has encountered a mismatch, and the mesolimbic circuit is treating that mismatch as a signal worth pursuing. Wolfram Schultz at the University of Cambridge spent 2 decades mapping this exact circuit in primate neurons, publishing the foundational reward prediction error model in Science in 1997, and what his electrodes recorded was this: the dopamine signal does not fire when you get what you expected. It fires when the gap between expectation and reality is largest. Uncertainty is the trigger, not resolution. Uncertainty. Feynman understood this intuitively. He spent the last years of his life writing about it explicitly. He called it the pleasure of finding things out, but the language underneath that phrase was always mechanistic. He was describing the dopamine circuit without naming it. Every time he approached a new problem, he refused to accept a label as an explanation. The word electricity is not an explanation of electricity. The word friction tells you nothing about friction. Strip the label, strip the borrowed explanation, strip the textbook answer, and what remains is the actual structure of the phenomenon. That stripping process is not intuitive. It requires deliberate, effortful inhibition of a specific neural shortcut. The shortcut has a name. It is called semantic satiation's cognitive cousin, but more precisely, what neuroscientists call categorical substitution. When your brain encounters a complex phenomenon and already has a category label for it, the label fires and the investigation stops. The anterior temporal lobe, which stores semantic categories, essentially closes the circuit before the prefrontal cortex can open it. You know the word magnet. The moment the word fires, the anterior temporal lobe signals. Category matched, continue. The question of why 2 magnets repel, the actual mechanism, the exchange of virtual photons between ferromagnetic domains, the quantum mechanical exchange interaction between electron spins, never gets asked. The label absorbed the question before it could form. What Feynman trained himself to do was delay that closure. Functionally, he was suppressing the anterior temporal shortcut long enough for the prefrontal cortex to enter the high uncertainty state, which then triggered the dopamine prediction error signal, which then fueled the investigation. This is not a metaphor for curiosity. It is the sequence of neural events that constitute what we experience as curiosity, and it is trainable. But there is a second mechanism operating through the same cognitive substrate at the same time. Working memory. The temporary buffer system, housed primarily in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, has a hard capacity limit. George Miller at Harvard quantified this in 1956. Roughly 7 chunks of information, plus or minus 2, can be held simultaneously in working memory. When you are operating in borrowed explanation mode, when you are using labels instead of mechanisms, each label represents a chunk. Electricity is 1 chunk. Gravity is 1 chunk. Your working memory fills with words that feel like understanding, but are actually compressed pointers to things you have not inspected. Feynman's approach, his insistence on mechanism over label, does something counterintuitive to working memory. It temporarily increases the load because you are now holding the actual components of the phenomenon, rather than the label. But it also restructures those components into what cognitive psychologists call an elaborative encoding. You are not storing the word, you are storing the causal chain. And causal chains, once encoded, compress far more efficiently than arbitrary labels. Eleanor Maguire at University College London demonstrated the mechanical consequence of this in her 2000 study of London taxi drivers, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Taxi drivers who had spent years building detailed spatial causal maps, not just street names, but topological relationships between areas, showed measurable volumetric increases in the posterior hippocampus compared to controls. The hippocampus was physically restructured by the habit of encoding causal relationships rather than labels. The brain regions that handle relational memory expand when you give them relational information to store. Labels are not relational. Mechanisms are. Feynman's pedagogy, which he demonstrated most clearly in the 3-volume Feynman Lectures on Physics, assembled from his 1961-1964 Caltech undergraduate lectures, was built entirely on this principle. Every explanation started not with a definition but with a phenomenon. Not a conductor is a material that allows electrons to flow, but here is a copper wire. Here is what is happening inside that wire right now. The positive copper ions are fixed in a lattice. The valence electrons are not bound to any particular ion. They are moving randomly at roughly 1.6 million meters per second. Apply a potential difference across the ends, and what changes is not the speed of the electrons. They are already moving extremely fast, but the direction. You add a drift velocity, roughly 0.001 meters per second. The signal travels at nearly the speed of light, but the electrons themselves drift at walking pace. That is what a conductor is. Not a definition. A machine. When you think this way, when you insist on the machine underneath every label, something specific happens in how your brain handles novel problems. The encoding is different. The retrieval is different. And critically, the transfer is different. Transfer is the technical term for applying knowledge from one domain to solve problems in another. It is the hardest thing for human cognition to do reliably. Most education fails at transfer almost completely. Students who can solve textbook problems in the exact format they were taught fail to recognize the same problem in a different context. Robert Bjork at UCLA has documented this failure for 4 decades. The distinction he draws is between learning and performance during practice. A student who memorizes a label performs well during the test that uses that label. Bring the same phenomenon to them wearing different clothes. A physics problem framed as a biology question, a geometry problem embedded in a financial scenario, and the performance collapses, because the label does not transfer. The label is bound to its context. The mechanism transfers, because the mechanism is the same regardless of the surface. Feynman transferred constantly, fluidly, and in directions that surprised everyone around him. His work on the superfluidity of liquid helium, his contributions to the theory of weak nuclear force alongside Murray Gell-Mann, his parallel path work in nanotechnology, his role in the Challenger disaster investigation, these are not the outputs of a specialist. They are the outputs of a person who carried mechanisms rather than labels, and who could therefore recognize the same mechanism when it appeared wearing a completely different surface. And here is where the cognitive engineering becomes specific and reproducible. The protocol Feynman described, most explicitly in what became known as the Feynman technique, though he never named it, has 4 components that map directly onto known cognitive operations. First, take a concept and write it out as if explaining it to a child with no prior knowledge. Not a simplified version, a complete version. The constraint of plain language forces the prefrontal cortex to surface gaps. If you cannot explain it simply, you have a label, not a mechanism. Second, when you hit a gap, a place where the explanation breaks down, a place where you reach for a word because you do not know what is underneath the word, stop. That gap is information. That gap is the dopamine trigger. Third, return to source material and rebuild that specific section from first principles. Not the whole concept, the broken piece. Fourth, rebuild the explanation. Each cycle of this loop produces measurable changes in what Pooja Agarwal at Washington University calls retrieval-induced facilitation, the process by which the act of retrieving information, especially under difficulty, strengthens the encoding far more than rereading the same material. The gap-finding step in Feynman's protocol is not a failure state. It is the highest value moment in the sequence. Your brain, when forced to retrieve and failing, is running a calibration cycle on its own model of the world. The correction that follows is encoded more deeply than any information that required no effort to retrieve. Robert Bjork calls these desirable difficulties. They are not pleasant. They are, at the cellular level, the mechanism by which synaptic potentiation produces durable memory. Now, I want you to think about what happens to the dopamine system across 10 minutes of this state. At the start, you have the prediction error spike, the gap between what your existing model predicted and what you are actually finding when you look at the mechanism. That spike decays if you stop. If you continue engaging, if you keep asking the next question, if you keep following the causal chain deeper, the circuit does not simply return to baseline, there is a secondary phenomenon. The nucleus accumbens, which processes motivational salience and regulates the willingness to sustain effortful behavior, receives continued dopaminergic input as long as the uncertainty is unresolved, but the investigation is making progress. Wolfram Schultz's model distinguishes between two signal states, dopamine firing for full prediction error and dopamine firing for partial prediction error. The partial resolution signal is actually more sustained than the initial spike. Progress within uncertainty is a more durable motivational state than either pure confusion or complete understanding. This is why deep engagement with a genuine mechanism feels different from reading a summary. The summary resolves too quickly. The mechanism keeps yielding. What this means is that 10 minutes of first principles thinking is not 10 minutes of the same cognitive state. It is a self-amplifying loop. The dopamine signal that begins with the first gap sustains itself as long as each gap partially resolves into a smaller, more specific gap. You are not depleting the circuit, you are feeding it. The effort feels harder than reading a summary. It is harder. The neural cost is higher, but the motivational state it produces is more durable, and the encoding it creates is structurally different. Here is the part of this story that I find worth sitting with. In February 1986, Richard Feynman sat before the Rogers Commission investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster and performed in public the exact cognitive operation he had practiced for 60 years. The engineers at NASA and Morton Thiokol had been using labels. Acceptable risk. Within tolerance. Engineering judgment. Feynman asked for a glass of ice water, dropped an O-ring sample into it, removed it, and showed that the rubber had lost its elasticity at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. He had replaced the label acceptable risk with a mechanism, a material property at a specific temperature, a seal that could not perform its function. The Challenger launched at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The label had survived every review. The mechanism had been documented in internal memos and then buried under the weight of institutional momentum and the cognitive cost of actually understanding the thing versus using the word for it. Feynman's contribution to the investigation was not genius, it was protocol. Strip the label, find the mechanism, ask why the mechanism is the way it is. He had done this 10,000 times before he arrived at that hearing. It was not an insight, it was a habit with a 30-year training history. The neurological consequence of that training history is measurable. Eleanor Maguire's taxi drivers showed hippocampal expansion after years of relational encoding. A 2016 study by Hikaru Takeuchi and colleagues at Tohoku University, published in Cerebral Cortex, found that individuals who habitually engaged in effortful, divergent thinking showed significantly greater white matter integrity in the corpus callosum, the fiber bundle connecting the left and right hemispheres, compared to controls matched for IQ. The connection was not about raw intelligence, it was about habitual cognitive operation. The brain had physically reorganized around the habit. The myelin sheaths around the axons in the corpus callosum were thicker, which means faster signal transmission between hemispheres, which is the exact hardware required for the kind of cross-domain transfer that Feynman demonstrated throughout his career. White matter grows with use, not quickly, not dramatically, but measurably. The routing between hemispheres improves when you repeatedly ask the brain to connect things that are not usually connected. A physics problem that looks like a biology problem, a mechanism from fluid dynamics that explains a social phenomenon, a geometry that appears in economics. Feynman was not born with unusually dense corpus callosum white matter. He built it. The IQ of 125 is the relevant baseline. The Nobel Prize is the output of a deliberate structural modification. You will not rewire your corpus callosum in 10 minutes, but you will change your dopamine state. You will enter the high uncertainty encoding mode. You will fire the prediction error circuit in the ventral tegmental area. And if you follow the mechanism, if you refuse the label and go one level deeper, you will produce an elaborative encoding in the hippocampus that will be structurally different from anything you produce when you read a summary. The memory will be wired to the causal chain rather than the category label. The next time you encounter anything that shares that causal chain, even if it looks completely different on the surface, the retrieval will be faster, more reliable, and more likely to transfer. That is not motivation. That is the physics of the circuit. The object you looked at, at the start of this. The cup, the chair leg, the edge of the table. You looked at it for 10 seconds, you probably named it, and stopped. The name is not the thing. The thing is atoms held at specific interatomic distances by electromagnetic forces between electron clouds, arranged in a geometry that was determined by the processing temperature and pressure applied during manufacturing, obeying mechanical stress distributions that Euler's beam equations would predict if you applied them. The color is not a property of the object, it is the wavelength of light that the molecular structure of the surface fails to absorb between 400 and 700 nanometers, converted by your retinal cone cells into electrochemical signals, processed by the V4 region of your visual cortex, into a perception that feels like a quality of the thing, rather than a computation happening inside you. You looked at it and saw a cup. Feynman looked at things and saw machines all the way down. Not because he was smarter, because he had practiced stopping before the label fired long enough for the next question to form. He did it so many times that the habit restructured the routing between his hemispheres, modified the encoding behavior of his hippocampus, and produced a motivational state that made the effort feel less like discipline and more like appetite. 10 minutes is enough to feel what the circuit feels like when it opens. That is the starting condition for everything else.